I'm Matt Brownell.
And I'm Van Owens.
And I'm Jim Garton.
And I'm Tim Adams.
Welcome to Climbing the Mountain, where we dive into the scriptures and discuss themes, connections, and real-life application. All right, we are back, and we are talking about the Sermon on the Mount section in Matthew 5, verses 11 through 16. Last time we talked about the persecution we can face that drives us deeper into our relationship with Christ, that we have a hope that is before us so we can have joy even in the midst of suffering. And we're connected and identified with Jesus in this. Now we're going to get into some of the metaphors that he uses about being salt and light. And Van, do you want to read Matthew 5, 11
I'd
through
love
16?
to. Matthew 5, starting in verse 11, says, "Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven."
Great. Thank you. All right. Not everyone salts their roads in winter, but we live in New England where we do. We're used to seeing salt on roads and sidewalks and all over the place, and it feels like it's just in the air. But we might miss the context of what Jesus intended here. We might even read into it things Jesus didn't have in mind. For instance, he didn't live in cold New England or drive a car. So what is the point of his salt analogy?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot we can pull out here. But the part that stands out to me when I'm hearing about salt losing its saltiness, right? There's a warning there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And there's, I think, this warning in a lot of scripture where people are called to be faithful with God.
Mm-hmm.
And many people might start out faithful, but they might not be able to make it to the end. And we see that challenge for many people in the Old Testament. But I also, we see that call to persevere a ton for us in the New Testament as well. And there's so many examples. I was thinking about Romans 11, where Paul's going into this long discussion about the Jews and the Gentiles. But he's saying, there's a possibility of, if God cut off the natural branches and you were grafted in, if you don't continue in his kindness, that you could also be cut off, right? There's a sense of persevering to the end, remaining in the faithfulness of God, because there's a chance that the salt can lose its saltiness. So I don't know. To me, one of the big things about this is you're going to get persecuted. It's going to get hard. There's going to be challenges. And so in the midst of all of that, there's a lot of hope that we can hold on to, but you need to hold on to it. You need to stay faithful to the end.
Yeah.
So I appreciate what you said, Tim, about the distinctiveness, and like you have to stay distinct, right? Like you can't just all of a sudden let too much other stuff in, because if there's too much stuff in salt, I'm an engineer and we deal with impurities in materials, and once you get impurities in material, that material is no longer good for what you intend to use it for.
Right.
And so it seems like Jesus is saying a similar thing of like, you have to stay distinct. You have to stay
That's right.
unique. You can't just let all the other stuff in. And I have more
Yeah.
to say about that probably in the next question. I also think it's interesting that in Leviticus 2:13 it says to season all grain offerings with salt.
Yeah.
What does that mean? And what is Jesus trying to get at? I'm not entirely sure. It goes so far in Leviticus to say, "Don't bring me a grain offering without salt." Is Jesus trying to say something about like you guys are critical to worship? Like people are going worship is the act of honoring God. You are critical to this. You are a part of honoring God in the world. Maybe I truly don't know. I also know salt was a really valuable resource.
Yep.
Like it was not salt was not it was considered something that was worth fighting over. And we can make all sorts of analogies with that. I don't know how many are actually appropriate, but I hear all of this and I go, and I'm not sure how it coalesces, but it certainly sounds like useful and needed.
Yeah.
And it almost feels like Jesus is saying, you are the salt of the world. The world cannot work without salt.
Right.
And I need you in this world. That's how it feels a little bit to me.
Right.
Yep. I think you're right. I think there's actually an interesting, I like what you said about being an engineer and salt losing its saltiness. I think if you have too much impurities in there, I love that connection because I think it's totally what Jesus has in mind here. He lived in an area where, the Dead Sea was very salty, and you might see some salty looking substances on the side, and you could pick it up and refine it even more so that it was purer salt, and you get rid of what's the leftover stuff? That's junk. That's not going to help you at all.
Right.
And back then, salt, I think, is important to note. It was a preserving agent.
Yeah.
So they didn't have refrigeration. So, think of like beef jerky or something, right? You dehydrate it, put a lot of salt on it, and it's safe to eat, I guess.
It needs to be safe to eat. You can't do I guess in those days.
Yeah, I don't know how long some of those beef jerkies have been sitting on the shelf, but they've got a lot of salt in them, and that's why you can still eat them. And I feel like that's what he's getting at here, that you're to be a preserving agent in the world. The world is going astray. It's slowly corrupting and we're degrading. Paul talks about the whole world is groaning. Isaiah talks about it being a garment that's wearing out. But we're supposed to bring this renewal and preserve what's good. And this idea of salt losing its saltiness, that word is really interesting. Because that's not a normal. They didn't have like a normal word for losing your salt, loses its saltiness. How we render that. The word's actually moraino, which is where we get the word moron. It's become moronic. So if you put that together, and Paul uses that same word to talk about the world's wisdom in Corinthians. It's moronic, and so if you put this all together, if we lose what makes us distinctively Christian. If we blend into the world all around us, we can't preserve it. We're useless. Worse, we're morons.
Yeah, I've heard all the stuff about salt being a preservative, and it's really important when reading a passage like this to get back into what the original audience would have thought, because when I think of salt, it really only has there's two things. One is what I put on food, and the other is what I put on my driveway in the wintertime.
Yeah.
And that's really the whole context in which I think of salt. But for them, salt was more like maybe the way we would think of, I don't know, electricity. You think of what would happen to your life if suddenly electricity was not electric anymore. Right? What impact would that have on your life? It would impact your life immediately and in a huge way.
Without being sarcastic and without like trying to exaggerate, I think most of us would last about 3 days without electricity.
I don't know if I could last 3 days.
Yeah, our world's not built for it.
Yeah, our
Right.
world is built
Yeah.
on electricity.
I don't carry cash anymore, ever. Which means that the only way I can buy anything is with something electric has to be involved. Something, and so when I thought of it that way, it was really helpful for me to say to think, this is perhaps maybe it's not a good analogy, but this is when they heard the word salt. Salt was a huge part of how they live their lives.
So you're saying it was so intertwined in their day-to-day life that it was something they used constantly,
Right.
and probably sometimes without even thinking about
Yeah,
it.
it was inconceivable. They could not think of life without salt. It just would make life so hard. And I love what you said, Matt, about it being a preservative. I think that was probably its primary function for them. And when you live, as many of these people did, a subsistence level life, that it was very important for you to be able to preserve what food you had. Because you never knew when you would be able to get more.
Yeah. Yeah. Good stuff.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I love that.
So if we think about, stay on salt for a second, if you rub salt on a wound, it stings.
Stings?
It stings a lot. The church is supposed to play a vital role in the world, but we're not going to be appreciated for it. We talked about before being persecuted, right? How do we fulfill our role in the world to be salt and preserve it and continue to fulfill this role even when the world may be like, no thanks?
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of take a flamethrower to decades of American Christian orthodoxy, which I don't think is actual biblical orthodoxy. But I've heard a lot of preachers say, and I think there is some truth to it, that the hope of the world is Jesus and not the church. Like the church isn't the hope of the world, and I think we give too little. I think we usually say that. Or maybe not usually, often say that to let the church off the hook for the ways it doesn't resemble Jesus. That's just Jim's observations. We can pretend we're different, but like God reaches people through partnering with people. He doesn't just reach people by like a voice from heaven coming down and saying, Tim Adams, I would like you to follow me. He reaches Tim Adams by putting people in Tim Adams' life to show him Jesus. He reaches people he reached me by putting people in my life to be salt, to be distinct, to be different. And I think I think this is an area where we can let ourselves off the hook a little bit. We are supposed to be engaging the world for God's purposes. We're supposed to be engaging this. But if we're not salt, if I'm the same as every other person in the town I live in, right? If I don't parent differently, if I don't act differently.
Just blend in.
Yeah, if I just blend in, but I go to church 2 or 3 times a week.
Who's going to know?
That's who cares? Like you're just adding things to your schedule. Now you just have a more stressful schedule than everyone else.
People might look at you like, oh, goody over there.
Yeah. But if I'm different, and I became a Christian because one of the families I was friends with their son, they looked different. I mean, I didn't know what was going on, but they looked different. There was something distinct about them as a family that I didn't see in my family.
There is an attractiveness too, right? I mean, yes, people are going to persecute in a sense. No one likes to be exposed because our deeds are not that great. But then there's also on the flip side, you see something that's working, like real love exhibiting. You're like, whoa, I want that.
Yeah, and I think we need to be intentional about not just about both our community and how our community is distinct. Like, do we treat each other differently? Do we talk to each other differently? Do we resolve conflict differently as a community than people see when they're outside? That's a real question we have to
Yeah.
engage with. Do we hold grudges in our community? Do we play politics the same way we do at work or at kids' sports or things like that? Or do we treat everyone with dignity and respect? I think the other thing is we have to, and I'll probably bring this up again in this series, is what do we look like at home? I mean, what do you look like? What does your family look like behind closed doors? And we can't engage the world if we are just exactly like everyone else. We can't engage and partner with God if we look like everybody else in our neighborhoods.
Yeah.
We have to look different, not just, and that doesn't mean we beat everyone over the head with look how great we are, but it means when we have people into our home, do they know that our home is different? Can they tell that our family is different
Right.
than everyone else?
Yeah.
Yeah, I love
Good
what you
stuff.
said there, Jim. Because Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth."
Yeah.
He could have easily said, "I'm the salt of the earth." And there are times when Jesus did say things about himself. I am the way, the truth, and the life. But here he says, "You are," and I think that it is so easy to use the church as an excuse. And what I mean, it's so easy to say, well, and even from within the church, to be able to say, well, look at what they're doing up there on the stage. That's wrong. The church is a mess. It's not being like Jesus, and give yourself an out away from the church to say, well, all that imperfection means I don't have to strive for perfection. But it's also easy to it puts the responsibility, I think, on each of us to, and I think he gets even more into this when he talks about light, but to not just the church is not something that's outside of you, that it's got to be something that is you. That the church is you, and the church can only become you if you live like you're the salt of the earth. If you, to get back to the question, what about the fact that it stings?
Yeah,
and I don't know, did they use salt as an antiseptic back then?
Putting salt on
wounds?
your wounds?
I don't know if they actually did, but the process of healing a wound, even now in modern medicine, is not always
Quick.
comfortable or quick. It often involves pain.
Yeah.
It often involves, it involves sometimes somebody taking a knife and cutting you open, which is not a pleasant, but if you're going to be the one who does that, you want to do it with some bedside manner, right?
Right.
Yeah.
You don't want a doctor who says to you, okay, so you're sick. I'm going to stab you and fix it.
Yeah.
Which is essentially what they do with surgery, right?
Yes.
But you want a doctor who's going to explain it to you, who's going to help you through it, who's going to explain and be accurate and say, this is what it's going to require, but this is what the end product is going to be. You're going to be healed.
Van, I love what you said about kind of the healing a wound is not, it's time consuming and it involves pain. And as a veteran of multiple knee surgeries, I was like, I've experienced this.
Yeah.
But when I tore my ACL, first of all, my knee looked like it was
a balloon, right?
Yeah, it was ballooned
Yeah.
up to
Yeah.
huge. It wasn't a balloon you could pop. It was all scar tissue. So,
Gross.
and really early in the physical therapy, the guy doing the PT would massage the scar tissue, and it killed. It felt horrible. I hated every second of that. And then early in the PT, it was boring, and my legs hurt because I had no leg muscles after.
So
after
quickly it atrophies, right?
2 weeks after surgery, I had no leg muscles left, and so I'm hurting. I'm tired. It stinks, and it takes 9 months to a year to recover from an ACL injury. And it's 9 months to a year of this is not fun.
No.
But I also think about that as, that was in 2005, so almost 20 years ago. Or was it 2006? I don't remember. I think 05. It was so almost 20 years ago I had that knee surgery, and now I'm almost 40 and I can do anything I want to do. I play hockey when I want to play hockey, when my schedule allows. I can ski, I can play tennis, I can do all that because I healed and had to go through that. Whereas I have friends who never healed the wounds.
Yeah.
And my best friend is now he's the same age as me, and he just had a procedure done to like delay knee replacement surgery because he's young enough that you only get like so many shots at new knees. And they're like, you are too young for us to project this out in a way that's good. So I think what you're saying, this process of healing, to bring it back to what Van said and not just a story about Jim's knee surgeries, this process of healing, it hurts, it stinks, it's not fun, but it has incredible benefits down the road. And, I'd like the doctor to be nice to me about it.
Yeah, it's always nice. when
It'd
they're
be
nice.
preferred, but we have to go
get
through the
Dr.
process.
Stabby.
Yeah, Dr. Stabby. Let's not go down that rabbit hole.
Doctor,
But
I think you should change your last name.
yeah, let's change that one up. But I think, Van, you touched on a really good thing, that we have to go through the healing process. And sometimes the salt and rubbing the salt, and we know like sterilizing a wound, it probably doesn't feel good. It may in fact hurt like heck.
But it might save your life too.
Yeah,
Right.
It might be the thing that allows you to keep going.
Yeah.
So I love that you brought that out.
Yep. Yeah, I think there's a couple things. I think this relates back to the discussion we were having about our reward and how we can have joy. There's an element here where we persevere in faith through hope, right? That we, that's too bad. But also being courageous, right? And not relying on our own wisdom and, which is worldly wisdom, but relying on God, trusting Him. Okay, I know He said I should talk about this. I don't want to, but all right, I see this. This isn't good. I shouldn't let it go. I should talk to this person. They're messing up their life somehow. How do I do that? Well, I think that's also an important question, because there's ways to do it where you're going to not be heard right away.
Yeah.
And then there are other ways. And I think when I've, I don't want to talk about specifics, but when I've talked to some people, sometimes I've seen something that has not been good. I think it's been helpful for me to relate to the person, because I am a jar of clay too.
Right.
Yep.
And I am, I've got a treasure inside that's what I should be pointing back to, the power that's inside of us, God with us, not my own power and some great thing that I've done. Anywho, I think that's the important thing, letting the light shine through our cracks, pointing back to the source, God, not us.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we live in a space where we're called to be the salt of the earth. And yet He's like, but you can lose your saltiness, right? There's a humility that needs to come from that. That it's not, we haven't been stamped and now we're like inherently like God's gift to the world, right? It will
never change.
And it will never change. It's like we have to continue to partner with God. And that's what's been helpful for me to think about this. There's such a incredible call here to be the salt of the earth, to be a preserving agent, an agent of healing. And the only way that I'm going to be able to do that is if it's like just flowing out of my life. So a lot of you have talked about that. But I think what's been helpful for me to think about, okay, how do I continue to fulfill that role? This is the way I structure my life now, right? Like I need to think about all of the rhythms and habits and practices that I'm doing in my life and think about, are these bringing me closer into discipleship to Jesus? Are these making it so that when people just interact with me, they see, wow, you're different, right?
Yeah.
If I'm fundamentally not different, then I talk about being different.
That's a disconnect.
It's a
isn't it?
disconnect.
Yeah.
And so, but if I'm aligning my life to be under discipleship and following Jesus, then the talking's just gonna come.
Right.
And it's gonna flow out of that, and there's real opportunity there. So
That's power.
at least at this moment of my life, like this phase, that's like I'm just trying to lean into that and like focusing a little bit less about, okay, the targeted, I'm going to fix this person, or like I'm just like, okay, I see this area and this area and this area of my life that are not under lordship to Jesus, or the lordship of Jesus, that they can be.
Yeah.
How do I actually train to align those parts of my life so that so that this is just a part of who I am?
I like that. I think it has power because it's born from a genuine walk with God. Like you're authentic. And so when you talk to someone, then they could actually see, oh, this is good. And maybe they have hope at that point, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that connecting with that hope is what everyone needs.
So I want to give a homework assignment if you're listening to us and you're down for it, because I think we've been talking a lot about these things, and this is all really good, and I really love what Tim said about like just being instead of doing, right? Like I'm going to be a person who's with God, not like complete the check box of what that looks like. And I'd like everyone who's listening, if you're up for it, to look at what areas God's actually calling us to be distinct in, and look at some ways, both in our big lives, but in our little like moments. I'd like everyone to think, and we're probably not going to give answers on this particular podcast, because that's a wrestling match I want you to do. It's a wrestling match I'm doing to figure out, how does my life, both in the big ways and the small ways, resemble salt in Jesus and what he's trying to be for us,
Good stuff. Good homework. All right, I think we can wrap that here. We've talked about the salt of the world, and next time we're going to come back and talk about being the light of the world. Thanks.